Ever since the Atlanta Thrashers moved to Winnipeg to become the Winnipeg Jets, conference realignment has been a persistent issue throughout the National Hockey League. Since the Jets moved from Atlanta and the NHL didn't restructure the divisions when they began play in Winnipeg, they were still stuck in the Southeast Division, even though they are nowhere geographically close to Florida, North Carolina, or Washington, D.C. As a result, the team has had to travel ridiculous miles to play their road half of their division games. The Jets will travel a total of 27,431 miles this season alone, the most in the Eastern Conference. For a point of reference, the New Jersey Devils will travel 11,659 miles, the fewest of any team in the National Hockey League. The Eastern Conference Jets are geographically further west than the Minnesota Wild, Detroit Red Wings, St. Louis Blues, Chicago Blackhawks, Nashville Predators, and Columbus Blue Jackets. In other words, the league's got to fix that. And in 2011, they tried to do so. In December 2011, the NHL proposed a realignment plan that would eliminate divisions as we know them, and instead placed teams in 4 different conferences, with the Western teams having 2 conferences and the Eastern teams having 2 as well. The initial proposal had 16 teams in the West and 14 teams in the East, 2 8-team conferences in the West and 2 17 conferences in the East. Conference A, as we heard of, consisted of Anaheim, Calgary, Colorado, Edmonton, LA, Phoenix, San Jose, and Vancouver. So the Mountain Time teams and the Pacific Time teams. Conference B consisted of Chicago, Columbus, Dallas, Detroit, Minnesota, Nashville, St. Louis, and Winnipeg. So everybody in this Central Time zone and a couple teams in the Western Conference in the Eastern Time. That would be Detroit and Columbus. Conference C, now we're moving over to the East, consisted of Boston, Buffalo, Florida, Montreal, Ottawa, Tampa Bay, and Toronto. And Conference D consisted of Carolina, New Jersey, New York Islanders, New York Rangers, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Washington. Now, if we want to look a little bit closer at Conference C, as I mentioned earlier, the 2 Florida teams, Tampa Bay and Florida, were proposed in a conference with teams that are all north of Pennsylvania. So they were not going to like this realignment plan. And one reason the owners really liked this plan is that every team would have the chance to play each other home and home, and fans would be able to see the premier players in the game at least once in their home venue. And to make an example, Sidney Crosby, he will make an annual appearance in all of the California venues. As much as some fans dislike Sidney Crosby, he's the best player in the NHL right now, and people want to see him play. And he brings a crowd, whether or not it's the Pittsburgh fans or the casual fans that realize, oh, Sidney Crosby is coming into town. I've heard he's really good. I'll go watch. Now, of course, the biggest concern was how the playoffs are going to be figured out, because they're getting rid of the 2 conference system and instead putting 4 separate conferences. So that was an issue for quite a while, and still is, of course. Each conference they're going to have to, because there's 4 conferences, each conference is going to have a divisional playoff format among the top 4 teams. After 2 rounds of divisional playoffs, there's going to be a final 4, and as they all face off against each other, the best team in Conference A versus Conference B, or the team that makes it out of both conferences, and of course the same thing with Conference C and Conference D in the East. And eventually the top two among all the conferences would duke it out in the Stanley Cup Finals. There was an issue with this as well, as the conferences weren't all even. Teams in the Eastern Conference had a higher probability of making the playoffs with this proposal than the teams in the West. And this was a radical idea, the 4-conference idea. It was a radical idea that would somehow solve everything, and it had widespread approval from the fans, media, and owners. I really like this plan myself as a Dallas Stars fan, as it would put the Dallas Stars out of the Pacific Division so that fans back home in Texas would be able to watch the most important division games. Unfortunately, the NHLPA did not see it the way the owners did and rejected the proposal. They rejected it on the grounds that The league never consulted with the players on the proposal, but under the provisions of the CBA, NHL didn't have to do that, and they chose not to. Players also felt that teams in smaller conferences had unfair advantages to make the playoffs over teams in the larger conferences due to the unbalanced nature of the conferences. By and large, the Players Association felt that the plan only fulfilled the interests of the owners and not so much the players. Over this past weekend, when the NHL came back after the lockout, the NHL announced new plans for realignment with roots to the rejected proposal from the previous season. The biggest difference, though, is that the 16 teams that used to be in the West are now in the East. The advantage the Eastern Conferences would have had due to having fewer teams in the East having fewer teams in each conference, that's what I meant to say. That advantage now belongs to the Western Conference. Eastern Conference 1 now looks like Carolina, Columbus, New Jersey, New York Islanders, New York Rangers, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Washington. And Eastern Conference 2 looks like Boston, Buffalo, Detroit, Florida, Montreal, Ottawa, Tampa Bay, and Toronto. Going over West, Conference 1 looks like Chicago, Colorado, Dallas, Minnesota, Nashville, St. Louis, and Winnipeg, all in the Central Time Zone with the exception of Colorado. And Western Conference 2 looks like Anaheim, Calgary, Edmonton, Los Angeles, Phoenix, San Jose, and Vancouver. What's interesting to note is that although Columbus and Detroit aren't that far apart from each other geographically, the NHL separated them by putting one in each Eastern Conference. To address the potential issues with having lower odds to make the playoffs in the Eastern Conferences, the NHL is reportedly looking into a form of a wild card to allow perhaps the team that finishes in 5th place in each Eastern Conference to have a chance to make the first round of the playoffs. We don't know much more than that, only that the idea is reportedly in place. The biggest winners, hands down, with realignment are the Dallas Stars and the Minnesota Wild in the event that this proposal goes unopposed. The Dallas Stars have been in the Pacific Division since 1998 and play most of their important games down the stretch at 9 p.m. Central at a time that many fans in DFW can't stay up to watch the entire game because of work or school. This new plan will have all their division games take place in the Central Time Zone, with, of course, the exception being in Denver. But Stars will be more than happy to only have to travel as far west as Denver for division games. In a similar situation is the Minnesota Wild, who also have to travel to the Pacific Time Zone to play Vancouver, and then, of course, the Mountain Time Zone, really far away from St. Paul, to play Calgary and Edmonton, and also Colorado. And they've been in the Northwest Division since 2000, and they have to travel more than any other team in the NHL this year, something north of 31,000 miles. And it's mostly because they have to travel to Western Canada and Colorado to play their division games. Those are not necessarily close areas for the Minnesota Wild. The reduced travel the team will have with this plan, like the Dallas Stars, will definitely satisfy the team and their fans. On the contrary, the biggest losers yet again with this proposal and the previous one are the Florida Panthers and the Tampa Bay Lightning. There really is no winnable scenario for the Lightning or Panthers because no matter what, they were going to have to travel long distances to play their division games. The Panthers and Lightning are in a division that has, like I said earlier, most teams north of Pennsylvania. That's going to be a little bit of an adjustment to get used to more travel. The NHL has to approve this plan pretty soon, though, because they have to release their schedule for next season as soon as well. As far as Western Conference teams are concerned, this plan more than satisfies them. Coming up after the break, the Senators lose a player for the season due to injury, but was the injury caused intentionally?